The Phantom Ranger. I've always enjoyed hiking alone. It's my time to clear my head, get away from the noise, and just be in the moment. I was on a trail I'd hiked before. Nothing too long, maybe 5 or 6 miles, but it had some steep parts that could catch you off guard if you weren't paying attention. It was early afternoon, the kind of time where the sun is still high, but there's a cool breeze coming off the ridge. I was getting close to the halfway point when I noticed him, a guy in what looked like a park ranger uniform. But there was something off about him. At first, I thought maybe I just missed him earlier. It was a relatively quiet trail, so I wasn't expecting to see many people. But as I got closer, I realized he wasn't wearing the official green of the Park Service. His shirt was a faded tan, not the usual khaki, and it looked a little too worn, like it hadn't been washed in weeks. The badge was there, but the edges of it seemed frayed, like it had been through too much sun and dirt. What really stood out was his face. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, but his eyes had this unnerving sharpness, almost like he was watching me before I even noticed him. He smiled when I walked up, but it didn't feel friendly. It felt like he was sizing me up. He introduced himself as Ranger Frank, and I instinctively felt a little uneasy. He said something about the trail I was on being tricky for solo hikers and offered to guide me down a safer route. At first, I thought maybe it was standard procedure, but something about his tone made me hesitate. I told him I was fine, that I had hiked this route before. He didn't seem to take no for an answer, though. He kept insisting, almost too insistently, that the other trail was much safer, and that it was easy to miss the turnoff. That raised a red flag for me. There were only 2 ways off that trail, and I knew both of them well. I tried to politely refuse again, but he didn't back off. In fact, his posture seemed to tighten, like he was waiting for me to agree. I could feel my stomach drop, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The way he looked at me, it wasn't like he was just trying to help. There was something possessive about it, like he was trying to control where I went. And then, the weirdest thing happened. He pointed down the trail, as if he already knew where I was going to walk next. "You're headed to the old forest path, right?" he said, his voice dropping lower. "It's not safe after dark, especially for someone alone." The thing is, I wasn't planning to go down that path. I was supposed to be heading toward the parking lot. At that point, I felt my anxiety spike. I glanced down the trail behind me, trying to gauge how far I was from the parking lot, but it felt like the whole situation had shifted somehow. This guy wasn't just being overly friendly. He was almost too familiar with the trail, too insistent on guiding me. I knew the park well enough, and I also knew the forest path he was talking about didn't even come close to where I was headed. I couldn't figure out how he could be so sure of where I was going. But the real kicker was when he stepped closer, just a little too close, and his eyes didn't leave mine for a second. "I'll walk with you," he said, almost like a command, not a suggestion. "It'll be safer for both of us if we stick together." I don't know why, but something inside me snapped, and I felt like I needed to get away from him. Fast. My instincts kicked in, and without another word, I turned and started walking briskly in the opposite direction. I could hear him behind me, shuffling along at an odd pace, but I didn't dare look back. It was like my feet were moving on their own, my body desperate to put distance between me and this man. The woods around me seemed quieter than usual, as if the whole area had gone still, waiting for something. That's when I heard it, the softest crunch of boots on leaves, not far behind me. He was following. My heart was pounding now, and I kept telling myself to stay calm, but the panic was rising with every step. The trail ahead of me started to twist, and I knew it would lead me to a dense patch of trees that would make it harder for anyone to follow. I made a split-second decision to turn off the path and duck into the brush, hoping I could lose him. I pushed through the undergrowth, branches scratching at my face, barely keeping my balance as I scrambled uphill. I didn't know exactly where I was going, but all I cared about was getting away from that guy. I hadn't heard his footsteps for a minute, and I let out a shaky breath, thinking I'd finally lost him. But then I heard his voice, low and steady, cutting through the stillness of the woods. "You can't hide from me," he said, his voice carrying strangely, almost like it was coming from all around me. It sent a chill down my spine. I froze in place, my pulse thundering in my ears. He wasn't just following me anymore. He was hunting me, like he knew exactly where I was, like he had been tracking me this entire time. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight with fear. I quickly scrambled back down the slope, trying to make my way back to the main trail, but every time I looked over my shoulder, it felt like I could see his shadow moving between the trees, always just a step behind. I don't know how much time passed, but my legs were aching, and my breath was coming in ragged gasps. The woods felt different now. Darker, more suffocating, as though the trees themselves were closing in around me. I finally broke through the underbrush and found the main trail again. But when I looked ahead, there was no sign of the parking lot. The path seemed longer than it should have been, and the trees stretched out in front of me like they were never ending. My mind was spinning. Had I taken a wrong turn? Was I going in circles? I tried to steady myself and focus, but the panic was clouding my thoughts. I knew the parking lot should have been just ahead, and then I saw him. Ranger Frank was standing at the end of the trail, just far enough away that I couldn't make out his expression, but I could feel his eyes on me. He hadn't followed me through the brush. He hadn't even taken the same path I did, yet here he was, exactly where I'd hoped to be. He was waiting for me. "I knew you'd come back," he said, his voice too calm, too certain. "You can't leave without me showing you the way." I froze again, every muscle in my body telling me to run, but something in my chest was gripping me tight, like I was paralyzed. I couldn't let this guy get any closer. Without thinking, I turned and ran down the trail, ignoring the sharp rocks underfoot, the branches that scratched at my arms. I had to get away. I don't know how long I ran for, but it felt like hours, my breath burning in my chest and my legs giving out from the effort. I could still hear his voice, faintly, like an echo through the trees, calling me back. It wasn't loud, but it was constant, like a murmur just under the surface of the wind. "You can't escape me," he kept saying. "You'll never get away." That's when I started to doubt everything. My heart was racing, my mind a jumbled mess. Had I imagined the whole thing? Had I just lost track of where I was in the woods and let my own fears get the best of me? But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I had never felt that watched, that hunted, in all my years of hiking. Eventually, I stumbled onto the main road that ran through the park. There were cars parked along the side, people walking toward the entrance. I burst out onto the pavement, gasping for breath, and tried to explain what had happened to a couple standing nearby. I was shaking too much to form a coherent sentence, but they didn't look at me like I was crazy. Instead, the woman's face twisted in confusion. "There's no ranger named Frank around here," she said. "There hasn't been anyone by that name working this trail for years." I felt the ground tilt beneath me. No one had seen him. I couldn't believe it. I had just been talking to him, hadn't I? I could still picture his face in my mind, his strange, too knowing smile. But when I looked back down the trail, there was nothing. Just empty forest. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, his piercing eyes, and that cold smile. I kept wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing, if my exhaustion and fear had played tricks on me. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how real it had felt. The way he had known where I was headed, the way he had insisted on guiding me even when I didn't want it. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was as if he had been waiting for me to make a wrong move, to get too close to something I wasn't supposed to. The worst part was when I tried to go back the next day to find the trail. I couldn't even remember where I'd seen him. The whole area looked different, almost like the woods had rearranged themselves overnight. It was like he'd never been there at all. I haven't hiked alone since then. I can't bring myself to go back to that park. Every time I think about it, I feel this weird knot in my stomach. I don't know who or what that man was. I don't know if he was some kind of ranger or something else entirely. But I know one thing for sure. I'm never going back to that trail. No matter what anyone tells me, there's something out there in those woods, something that I can't explain. And I'm not taking any chances with it. The stare in the woods. I've never been one to scare easily, especially not when I'm out hiking. I've done solo treks in some pretty remote places, but this one was different. I was about a day's walk from the nearest trailhead, deep in the woods, when I came across them, campers. I'd seen their tents from a distance and thought maybe I could ask them for directions or just hang out for a bit. It was getting late, and I didn't want to set up camp alone in the dark. As I approached, I noticed something was off. There was no sound, no chatter, no music, nothing. Just a few figures sitting by the fire, staring at the flames. As I got closer, they all turned their heads at once, like they'd been waiting for me. "Hey there," I said, trying to be friendly. "Mind if I join you for a bit? I'm out on a solo hike, and the night's coming in fast." The response I got wasn't what I expected. They didn't say a word, just nodded slowly, like they were confirming something to themselves. Their eyes didn't blink, and they never looked away from me as I set my pack down by the fire. It felt strange, like I was intruding on something I shouldn't be. But I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe they were shy, or just really into the silence of the woods. As I sat down, I noticed the fire wasn't crackling like a normal campfire should. It was almost too still. The flames flickered in this unnerving, perfect pattern, almost as if they were being controlled. The group, a mix of men and women, didn't offer me anything. No food, no drink, not even a casual conversation. Just those cold, unwavering stares. One of them, an older guy with a grizzled beard, suddenly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, rusted knife. He didn't look at it, just ran his fingers along the blade like he was testing its sharpness. I caught a glimpse of his eyes, and I swear they flashed with something dark when he saw me watching him. I felt my stomach twist. My gut told me to leave, but I kept telling myself I was overreacting. It was probably nothing. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. The only sounds were the occasional crack of a branch breaking in the distance and the soft rustling of the leaves in the wind. At one point, one of the women stood up and walked toward the edge of the campsite, never breaking her stare. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't help the feeling that I was being watched, that I was surrounded by eyes, even in the dark corners of the woods. She didn't come back for a while, and I didn't dare look away from the fire. But then, without a word, they all stood up at once, like they were synchronized, and one by one, they started walking toward the trees, disappearing into the shadows. That's when I knew. This wasn't a normal campsite. Something wasn't right. My heart started to race. I don't know why, but I felt a panic rising in my chest, something primal telling me to get out of there. I grabbed my pack, trying to act normal, like nothing was wrong, but my hands were shaking. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I was being pulled into something I couldn't control. That's when I noticed something else. The man with the knife hadn't gone into the woods like the others. He was standing just behind me, watching. I hadn't heard him approach, but there he was, too close, his presence like a heavy weight on my back. I turned slowly, trying not to show fear, but I couldn't stop the shiver that ran down my spine. "You're welcome to stay the night," he said finally, his voice low, too calm. "But you should know, some things around here are dangerous. You wouldn't want to stay out there after dark." I forced a smile, even though my mouth felt dry. I appreciate it, but I think I'll head out, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. His gaze never wavered, his lips barely moving as he spoke again, this time in a whisper that didn't match his slow, deliberate movements. Once you leave, you won't be able to come back. Not everyone makes it out, you know. The words hung in the air like a threat, heavy and suffocating. I didn't wait for him to say anything else. My instincts screamed at me to run. I didn't even pack up properly. I just grabbed my gear and bolted. I didn't look back as I ran through the trees, but I could feel their eyes on me. The woods felt different now, like the shadows themselves were watching, waiting. The air was colder, thicker, and every sound around me felt amplified. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the distant hoot of an owl, the crack of a branch snapping. I wasn't sure how far I'd gone when I finally slowed down, gasping for air, my chest tight with fear. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I'd overreacted. But something didn't sit right, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned around quickly, half expecting to see the campers standing there, but there was nothing. Only the endless trees, stretching out in every direction. I wasn't about to stop, though. I knew I had to keep moving, get back to the trailhead before dark. But as I walked, the sense of unease only grew. The forest seemed to close in on me, the trees growing taller, their branches reaching out like fingers trying to pull me back. My feet ached, my legs were stiff, but I kept going, trying to ignore the rising panic in my chest. I couldn't afford to stop now. That's when I heard it, a soft voice, barely a whisper, just behind me. You should have stayed. You should have stayed with us. My blood ran cold, and I froze, but when I turned around, there was nothing. Just the trees, the wind, and that oppressive silence. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, staring into the darkness, waiting for something, anything, to happen. My heartbeat was thundering in my ears, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. But there was nothing. No sound, no movement. Just the eerie quiet of the woods. After what felt like an eternity, I finally forced myself to turn around and keep walking, my feet dragging with exhaustion. The strange thing was, as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't heading back to the trailhead. The path I thought I had been on was now unfamiliar, twisted in a way that didn't make sense. The trees, too, seemed to have changed, the shapes more sinister, the shadows deeper. I picked up the pace, now fully aware that I had no idea where I was anymore. The sun had set by this point, and the night was swallowing everything around me. Every so often, I'd hear the soft rustle of something moving behind me. Too quiet to be an animal, too deliberate to be anything normal. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see one of them, one of the campers, standing just out of sight, watching me. But every time I looked, there was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being led somewhere I didn't want to go. And then, just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, I saw them. They were standing at the edge of the trees, just inside the darkness. I could barely make out their figures in the dim light of the moon, but I knew it was them, the campers. Every single one of them, standing perfectly still, staring at me with that same unsettling intensity. The older man with a knife, the woman who had wandered off earlier, even the young guy who hadn't said a word. They were all there, just watching me, like they were waiting for something. I didn't stop to figure out what it was. I turned and started running, this time without any hesitation. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't care. I had to get away from them, away from whatever the hell this was. The trees around me seemed to move as I ran, twisting and warping, like they were shifting to trap me. I couldn't even tell which way I was going anymore, just that I needed to put distance between me and them. It felt like the woods were closing in on me, pushing me toward something, like they had a mind of their own. My thoughts were racing, my vision blurry from the panic, and my body felt like it was on autopilot. I didn't know how long I ran, but eventually, I stumbled into a clearing. I couldn't see the campers anymore, but the sense of being hunted, of being followed, never left. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air, every part of me screaming that I had to keep moving, but I couldn't. I had no energy left. I don't know how long I sat there, trembling in that clearing, my mind racing with fear. I kept expecting to hear footsteps, to see them emerge from the trees, but nothing happened. It was almost too quiet, like the entire forest was holding its breath. I checked my watch. I had no idea how I had gotten so turned around, but it was well past midnight now. I had to make a decision. Either I keep going or I wait until daylight. But the thought of staying still, of waiting for them to find me, was unbearable. Slowly, I got up, wiped the dirt off my knees, and forced myself to move forward, praying I'd stumble upon a road or at least a familiar landmark. I walked for what felt like hours, my legs aching, my mind a blur. But no matter how far I went, the woods never seemed to end. I couldn't shake the feeling that the trees were closing in around me again, pushing me further into some endless loop. My eyes kept darting to the edges of the forest, expecting to see them emerge at any moment. And then, just as I was starting to lose hope, I saw it, a faint glow in the distance. My heart skipped a beat. A light, a real, human light. I ran toward it, ignoring the branches that scraped at my face, the thorns that tore at my clothes. The closer I got, the brighter the light became, and I thought, finally, I'd made it. As I reached the light, I thought I was safe. It was a lantern, hanging from a post in the middle of a small clearing. I stumbled forward, relief flooding me, until I noticed something that froze the blood in my veins. The lantern was flickering, its light dimming and brightening like it was malfunctioning, but it wasn't the light that caught my attention. It was the sign, nailed to a nearby tree. Welcome back. The letters were crude, like they had been hastily carved by someone who didn't care how it looked. My stomach dropped, and I turned around slowly, every hair on my neck standing on end. There, standing just behind me, were the campers, silent, still, and closer than before. My pulse hammered in my chest as I realized with sickening certainty that the light, the sign, everything was part of the trap. I didn't know how they'd done it, how they'd managed to lead me in circles, but somehow they had. I backed away, my mind racing. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't look away from them. They didn't speak, didn't move. They just stared. And for the first time since I'd run into them, I understood. This wasn't about being lost. It was about something far worse, something that had been waiting for me. I turned and ran again, but I never made it far. The darkness swallowed me whole. The Watcher in the Woods. I've been hiking in those woods more times than I can count, so I didn't think much of it when we decided to take the trail that day. It was supposed to be a simple, quiet hike, just me and my boyfriend, Daniel. We were well prepared, each carrying water, snacks, and my phone for photos, which I wasn't really in the mood for. My mind was mostly on how we could escape the noise of the city for a while. The air was crisp, and the trees had this stillness about them, almost like the forest was holding its breath. Daniel had mentioned wanting to explore a little off the main trail, but I wasn't up for it, so we agreed to stick to the path. At least, that's what I thought. We walked side by side for a while, laughing at something silly I'd said, then he started moving a bit faster. It wasn't unusual for him to get ahead of me. He was always more athletic, more into the physical part of hiking, but after a few minutes, I noticed he was out of sight. I thought he'd just stopped to take a break or maybe gone ahead to scout the trail. I kept walking, thinking I'd catch up to him soon, but after about 20 minutes of walking and calling out his name, my stomach started to twist. He should have been back by now. The strange thing was, I didn't hear anything, not even the usual sounds of the forest. No rustling leaves, no birdsong, just silence. I started to feel that tightness in my chest, the kind you get when something's just off. I retraced my steps, calling his name over and over, but there was no answer. Not even an echo. The forest felt different now, almost like it was closing in on me. I'm not someone who scares easily, but this was different. The air was thick, like the trees were watching me. I don't know how long I'd been walking, maybe an hour, before I saw him. This man, standing at the edge of the trail. He was just standing there, as if waiting for me. He looked normal, like any other hiker, but something about his stillness unsettled me. I slowed down, trying to get a read on him. He didn't say anything at first, just watched me as I got closer. When I was maybe 5 feet away, he finally spoke. "You're looking for someone, right?" he asked, his voice low but calm. "A man, dark hair, kind of tall." I nodded, my heart pounding. "Yeah, my boyfriend. Have you seen him?" I asked, my voice trembling before I could stop it. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at me for what felt like an eternity, and then he just said he went off the trail. The way he said it was strange. Too calm, almost like he didn't care about my concern. "Are you sure?" I pressed, my voice getting sharper. He just nodded slowly, as though he had nothing more to add. I don't know why, but I felt this cold shiver run down my spine. There was something about him, something I couldn't place, but it made my skin crawl. I wanted to keep asking him questions, but the way he stood there, almost like he was waiting for me to leave, made me uncomfortable. I got the feeling that if I stayed much longer, I might regret it. Something about the way his eyes moved, like they weren't really focused on me, but something else, something behind me. I couldn't put it together, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I thanked him quickly and turned to leave, but as I did, I heard his voice again, almost too softly to hear. "Be careful," he said. "The woods aren't safe, not tonight." That was it. No explanation, no warning, just that. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I didn't know whether to keep searching for Daniel or head back to the trailhead and get help. I was losing my mind at that point, too freaked out to think straight. But something inside me told me not to go back, that I couldn't leave without finding him. So I kept going, heart hammering in my chest, every step louder than the last. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I finally saw him, Daniel. But when I saw him, my blood ran cold. He was lying on the ground, hunched over, his hand pressed to his leg, blood soaking his shirt. His face was pale, eyes wide with a mix of pain and confusion. My stomach twisted, but the relief of finding him was short-lived. He looked different. His gaze didn't focus on me right away, and when he did finally look at me, he didn't seem relieved, like he should have been. Instead, there was fear, real fear in his eyes. I rushed over to him, my heart racing, asking what happened. He didn't answer right away, just stared at me like he couldn't quite process who I was. Then, with a shaky breath, he whispered, "Someone was following me." His voice was barely audible, strained. I looked around, instinctively checking the woods, but I didn't see anything. No one, no sounds, just the wind through the trees. "Who?" I asked, but he just shook his head, wincing as if the motion hurt. "I don't know," he muttered. "I thought it was you at first." But then, his voice trailed off, and he went silent again. I wasn't sure if he was delirious from the pain or if something more was going on. But I knew one thing for sure. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching us, and I had just narrowly avoided whatever it was. I helped him to his feet, though he could barely stand on his own. His leg was clearly injured, but it wasn't just that. It was the way he kept looking over his shoulder, like he was afraid someone was still there, just out of sight. I tried to help him walk back toward the trail, but he kept pulling away, his eyes darting around nervously. "They're still here," he muttered. "I swear they are." His grip on my arm tightened with every step, but no matter how much I tried to reassure him, the fear in his eyes wouldn't fade. We made it back to the main trail, but I swear to God, I could feel something watching us. Some presence that wasn't there before. It was like the forest had shifted, become more sinister. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it. And I couldn't shake the feeling that the man I'd met earlier wasn't just some random hiker. I didn't know who or what he was, but I knew he wasn't telling me everything. As we stumbled down the trail, Daniel kept muttering under his breath, his eyes flicking nervously to every rustle in the trees. I tried to focus on getting us to safety, but the air felt so heavy, like something was just waiting to pounce. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something coming up behind us. We finally made it back to the main trail, but I couldn't shake the sense that the forest wasn't done with us yet. The man from earlier kept creeping into my thoughts, his words spinning in my head. Be careful. Had he been warning me about something? Or had he been part of it? I didn't want to consider the possibility, but the more I thought about it, the less certain I was that we'd really been alone out there. When we finally reached the parking lot, I felt this strange weight lift off my shoulders. The familiar sight of our car brought a little comfort, but my mind was still racing. What had happened to us in those woods? Why had Daniel been so scared? I didn't want to ask too many questions, but I needed answers. He wouldn't talk. Not at first. When we got in the car and started driving, I could see he was still shaken. His leg was throbbing, but it was like his mind was elsewhere. Finally, after what felt like hours, he turned to me, his voice barely above a whisper. I swear I saw someone in the trees, watching us, the whole time. My blood ran cold, and it wasn't just because of his words. There was something about the way he said it, like he didn't even know if he believed it himself. But I did. We didn't speak much after that, the drive back to our apartment feeling longer than it should have. Daniel dozed off with his head pressed against the window, but I couldn't relax. Every little noise, every flicker of movement outside the car made me jump. I kept thinking about that man. His calmness, the vague answers, how he knew exactly who I was talking about before I even said anything. It didn't make sense. What kind of person just stands in the woods like that, saying strange things to a complete stranger? I couldn't shake the feeling that he was more involved than he let on. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized how wrong everything had felt from the moment we veered off the trail. Like we were being herded, almost. But by what? When we finally made it back home, I helped Daniel inside and tried to get him to sit down. He was exhausted, pale, and the blood on his leg had already started to dry, but he still wouldn't say much. I kept asking what happened, but he just kept shaking his head, like he couldn't find the words to explain. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing sounds outside our apartment, branches cracking, footsteps that seemed to echo. But when I checked, nothing, just the wind. I stayed up, staring at the ceiling, feeling like there was something I was missing, some piece of the puzzle that would finally make sense of it all. But nothing did. The next morning, Daniel was better physically, but his mind was still a mess. He wouldn't talk about the hike, and I didn't press him. But I couldn't forget the way he had looked at me in the woods. The fear in his eyes. I kept thinking that maybe whatever had been following us wasn't finished. Maybe it was still out there. A few days passed, and I thought I was starting to get a grip on everything. We didn't go hiking again, obviously. Daniel didn't even want to leave the house, and I understood. It was like that day in the woods had changed him somehow. He seemed distant, almost like he wasn't fully there anymore. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking, waiting to surface. One afternoon, I decided to go through my phone, looking for some pictures from the hike to maybe make sense of the day. Anything to make me feel like it wasn't all just a strange, terrifying blur. As I scrolled through the photos, my stomach dropped. There was a shot of the trail I'd taken while Daniel had gone ahead. But in the background, barely noticeable, there was a figure. A man, standing far off to the side, just behind a cluster of trees. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but when I zoomed in, I could see him clearly, wearing the same clothes the man had been wearing when I encountered him on the trail. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't just some random hiker passing by. I showed the photo to Daniel that evening, my hands shaking as I handed him my phone. "What do you think of this?" I asked, my voice low. He stared at the image, his face draining of color. He didn't say anything for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I don't know why he was there," he whispered, "but I saw him too, when I was alone in the woods. Before I got hurt." My heart sank. The man had been following us. He wasn't just some passerby, and he wasn't just a coincidence. This was deliberate. But why? What did he want? What had he done to Daniel? I wanted to press him for more details, but the look in his eyes stopped me. He looked lost, like he didn't want to remember anything else. I felt this deep, gnawing fear, the kind that starts in your chest and spreads until it fills your entire body. It was like something was still out there, something that hadn't finished what it started. I didn't sleep that night. The more I thought about that figure in the photo, the more unsettled I became. If he had been following us, then why hadn't we noticed him? Why hadn't we seen him at any other point on the trail, even though we'd both been looking around constantly? It didn't make sense. And then there was the man I'd met, the one who had given me those strange, cryptic warnings. Could he have been involved with the figure in the woods? Or was he just another piece of the puzzle? My mind kept spinning in circles, unable to find a pattern, unable to find any answers. The whole situation felt like one long nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The next morning, I was already on edge. Daniel was still quiet, withdrawn, like he was lost in his own head. But then something happened that I didn't expect. I went out to the balcony for some fresh air, trying to clear my mind, and that's when I saw him again. The man. He was standing across the street, just outside the woods, watching our apartment. My heart stopped. I couldn't believe it. He was just standing there, completely still, his eyes fixed on me. For a moment, I thought maybe it was just some weird coincidence. But then I realized he was waiting for something, waiting for us to notice. I didn't even think. I grabbed my phone and tried to take a picture, but by the time I had it aimed at him, he was gone, like he vanished into thin air. I stood there on the balcony, my heart racing, the phone still in my hand, my finger frozen on the shutter button. I couldn't understand what I'd just seen. The man had been there watching and then nothing. It was like he disappeared into the air. I quickly scanned the street, the trees, but there was no sign of him. I wasn't sure if I was just losing it from all the stress, or if it was something worse. My mind kept spiraling back to the woods, to the weird encounter, to Daniel's strange behavior. But when I turned back inside, Daniel was there in the doorway, looking at me with a strange expression on his face. I couldn't hide the fear in my eyes, so I just blurted it out. The man, he was out there, watching the apartment. Daniel froze. His face went pale, and for the first time in days, he looked genuinely terrified. "I knew it," he said, his voice shaky. "I knew it wasn't over." He slumped down on the couch, running his hands through his hair. "I saw him too, a few times after we got back. He's been following us, watching us from the woods. I felt my breath catch in my throat. How do you know that? I asked. He looked at me, his eyes wide, almost pleading. I saw him standing by the trees when I tried to go out a few days ago. I thought I was imagining it, but now I know I wasn't. He paused, as if weighing something in his mind, then looked at me with a mixture of fear and guilt. I think we've been marked by something in those woods. I had no idea what he meant by that, but his words sent a chill through me. What could he have seen in those woods that had him so terrified? What was stalking us, and why? But before I could ask anything else, Daniel looked over my shoulder, his face going even paler. "Look," he whispered. I turned around so fast I nearly tripped. And there he was again, the man. This time, closer, standing in the shadow of the trees right across from our balcony, just out of the corner of my eye. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I didn't know what to do anymore. I froze. I couldn't take my eyes off him, my heart pounding so loudly I thought Daniel could hear it. The man was just standing there, his posture stiff, his face unreadable. He didn't move, didn't blink. He just watched. My whole body went numb, and for a moment, it felt like the world had paused. I couldn't even bring myself to scream or move. I could feel Daniel's eyes on me, his breathing shallow, but neither of us said a word. The man didn't look away. It was as if he was waiting for something, waiting for us to make the next move. After what felt like an eternity, I heard Daniel's voice, barely a whisper. "He won't go away. Not until it's done." I didn't understand what he meant by that. I didn't know how long we stayed there, staring at the man, but eventually, he slowly stepped back into the shadow of the trees, disappearing once again like he had before. It was like he was never there. The second he was gone, I felt like I could breathe again, but the air still felt thick, like something was pressing down on my chest. I turned to Daniel, hoping for some sort of explanation, but all he did was shake his head. "I told you," he whispered. "I told you we shouldn't have gone off the trail. He's not human, not really. I don't think he was ever human." His voice cracked at the end, and I could hear the fear in it, the kind of fear that comes from knowing there's no escape. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to ask so many things, but I couldn't find the words. And I didn't know what else to do. That night, neither of us slept. It was like the weight of whatever had been haunting us in those woods followed us home. Every noise, every creak of the floorboards felt like a warning. But by morning, the feeling faded, like a bad dream you wake up from, only to realize the danger was never truly gone. We never saw the man again after that night. We didn't go hiking again, either. And eventually, life returned to a strange sort of normal. But I can't shake the feeling that whatever we encountered in those woods didn't end with us running back to the safety of the apartment. Something had been following us. Something still is. Shadow in the frame. I wasn't planning on hiking that day. It was a last-minute decision to clear my head. I drove out to this lesser-known trail about 40 minutes from my house. It wasn't super remote, but enough that you'd only see the occasional hiker or two. The weather was perfect, with that crisp autumn air and leaves crunching underfoot. About an hour into the hike, I spotted something off the trail, just barely visible among the leaves. It was a phone. It looked pretty beat up. One corner of the screen was cracked, but the thing still had some juice. I figured someone had dropped it, so I swiped up to see if I could find any emergency contact info. What I saw immediately made my stomach drop. There were dozens of photos, all taken on this very trail, of people walking alone. The weird part, none of them seemed to know they were being photographed. I scrolled further, feeling uneasy. Some photos had timestamps from just hours before, others went back weeks. Then there were videos. Short, shaky clips of hikers, zooming in from behind trees or bushes. My fingers hovered over one video before I finally pressed play. It showed a woman walking alone, with someone following her, just barely visible in the shadows. They were close enough that I felt like I should have heard the footsteps in the video, but the person walking didn't seem to notice. As the camera panned closer, I froze. The last frame was of the same section of the trail where I had just found the phone. My heart started racing, and I looked around instinctively, scanning the trees. There was no one there, at least not that I could see. I shoved the phone in my jacket pocket, my hands shaking. My first instinct was to turn back, but I was already pretty deep into the trail. Turning around would have meant walking back through the same spots where those photos and videos were taken. I told myself it was probably someone playing a sick prank, maybe even a trail cam set up for a scare. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I picked up my pace, trying to focus on the sound of my own footsteps and the crunch of leaves, but every so often, I'd hear something else. A stick snapping, a shuffle, like someone moving just out of sight. I'd whip around, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing. Just trees and the occasional bird flitting between branches. About 10 minutes later, my own phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, thinking it was a message or maybe a spam call. But it wasn't. It was a notification from Notes. A new one had appeared, titled, "Found You." My throat tightened, and I stopped dead in my tracks. I hadn't typed it. My hands were freezing, but I managed to open it. Inside, the message was simple: turn around. My stomach dropped. Slowly, I glanced over my shoulder, but there was no one there. The trail stretched back empty, the trees swaying slightly in the breeze. That was it. I started running. I don't even know how long I ran. My legs felt like they were on fire, and every step sounded louder, like the noise was echoing off the trees. I didn't dare look back again. I just kept going, dodging roots and rocks, trying not to trip. My mind was racing, replaying the photos and videos. Was someone actually out there? Were they watching me right now? Every shadow looked like it could be a person. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, I realized I had no idea where I was. The trail seemed different, like I had taken a wrong turn without realizing. My surroundings were quieter now. Too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves. Just this heavy silence pressing down on me. I pulled out my phone, desperate to check the map app and figure out how to get back. But the screen wouldn't unlock. Instead, it was glitching, flashing like someone was rapidly tapping on it. Then, out of nowhere, another note appeared. "You're close." My stomach churned. Close to what? My hands were trembling as I tried to close the app, but before I could, the flashlight on my phone switched on by itself. The beam cut through the trees, illuminating something ahead, a dark shape, low to the ground. It didn't move at first, but then it shifted, like it had noticed me. That was enough to send me bolting again. No idea where I was going, just running blindly. I could feel the phone bouncing in my pocket as I ran, the flashlight still on, casting wild beams of light in front of me. The trail was uneven here, littered with rocks and fallen branches, but I didn't stop. My chest was heaving, and my pulse was pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. But then, just faintly, I heard it, a laugh. Not loud, more like a muffled chuckle, low and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me. I didn't dare look back again. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to keep moving, to get out of there. But the trail wasn't leading anywhere familiar. I kept expecting to see the parking lot or even a familiar marker, but there was nothing. Just trees and that awful silence that made the laugh echo even louder in my head. Finally, I stumbled into a small clearing, tripping over a root and crashing hard onto the ground. My hands and knees were scraped raw, but I barely noticed. My phone flew out of my pocket, landing a few feet away, the flashlight still glowing faintly. I scrambled toward it, desperate to grab it and call for help, but as I reached out, another notification appeared. Stop running. My breath caught in my throat. I froze, my fingers just inches from the phone, when I felt it, a presence. Someone was there. I didn't see them, didn't hear them, but I felt them. It was like the air around me had thickened, pressing in on me, suffocating. I didn't dare move. My hand hovered over the phone, the glow from the screen lighting up just enough to see the dirt and leaves around me. I strained my ears, trying to pick up on anything. Footsteps, breathing, anything, but it was dead silent again. That was somehow worse than hearing something. My brain was screaming at me to grab the phone and bolt, but my body wouldn't respond. It was like I was frozen in place, waiting for whatever was out there to make the first move. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I grabbed the phone and flipped onto my back, shining the flashlight all around me. The beam cut through the trees, illuminating nothing but empty forest. But I knew I wasn't alone. That's when the phone buzzed again, almost making me drop it. This time, the notification wasn't from notes. It was from the camera app. My heart sank as I opened it, and my blood turned to ice. There was a new photo in the gallery, taken just seconds ago. It was me, lying on the ground in that clearing, flashlight in hand, eyes wide with fear. But what sent a shiver down my spine was what was behind me in the photo. There, just at the edge of the frame, was a figure, blurry but unmistakably human, peeking out from behind a tree. The worst part, the figure's hand was extended, reaching toward me. I sprang to my feet, my legs shaky but fueled by pure adrenaline. I didn't even bother looking back. The photo was burned into my mind, and the thought of whoever, or whatever, was out there closing in on me was enough to make me run harder than I ever had in my life. My flashlight was still on, but it was flickering now, like the battery was dying. Every time it blinked out, I half expected to see that figure right in front of me when it came back on. I didn't even know where I was going anymore. The trail was gone, and I was just crashing through the trees, my arms catching on branches, my breath ragged and shallow. Then, out of nowhere, I stumbled onto the trail again. Relief washed over me, but only for a split second. My phone buzzed again, and I nearly screamed. Another notification, this time from notes. The title read, "Wrong Way." My stomach twisted as I slowed down, glancing around frantically. The trail was straight ahead, but I felt like I couldn't trust anything anymore. The phone buzzed again. This time, the message simply read, "Behind you." I spun around so fast I nearly fell, the flashlight trembling in my hand. But there was nothing, just the empty trail, stretching into the darkness. That was when I realized the silence had returned, heavier than before, pressing against my ears. I didn't wait for another message. My gut told me to keep moving, even though every part of me was screaming that I was walking right into something I couldn't escape. My steps were slower now, deliberate, like I was trying to convince myself that I was still in control. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. The flashlight kept flickering, the beam weak and unreliable, making every shadow seem alive. I tried not to think about the message, about what could have been behind me just seconds ago. My mind was racing through possibilities. Was this some sick prank? Was I losing my grip on reality? But none of it explained the photos, or how the messages kept showing up on my phone. Suddenly, I heard it again, that low, muffled laugh, closer this time. My legs froze mid-step. It sounded like it was coming from just off the trail, hidden among the trees. My breathing was shallow, and my pulse throbbed in my ears. Then, the laugh stopped, replaced by a sound that made my blood run cold, slow, deliberate footsteps, crunching leaves and snapping twigs. They weren't hurried, almost like whoever, or whatever, was out there knew I had nowhere to go. My hands clenched the phone so tightly I thought it might crack. I held the flashlight up, pointing it toward the sound. The light flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure, just a flash of movement between the trees. But when I aimed the light again, there was nothing. I forced myself to keep moving, my legs stiff and unsteady. The trail was narrowing, the trees pressing in closer, and the flickering flashlight was barely cutting through the darkness anymore. My phone buzzed again, and I almost didn't want to look. But curiosity, or maybe desperation, got the better of me. The new message simply read, "Run." I didn't question it this time. I bolted, the world around me blurring as I focused on just putting distance between me and whatever was out there. The footsteps behind me picked up, matching my speed, but still calm, deliberate. Not running, just following. Somehow, that was even more terrifying than someone charging after me. As I ran, the flashlight finally gave out completely, plunging me into darkness. I almost tripped, catching myself against a tree, my hands scraped and raw. My breaths were coming in short, painful gasps. I looked back one last time, straining to see through the blackness. That's when I noticed it, a faint glow like the light from a phone screen, moving steadily toward me. It bobbed slightly with each step, growing brighter. My brain was screaming at me to run again, but my body felt paralyzed, my legs locked in place. The light was getting closer, and for the first time, I could make out the shape of a figure behind it, tall and still. Then, the phone buzzed one final time. The message simply read, "Got you." The moment I read those words, my body finally snapped out of its paralysis, and I took off blindly into the forest. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they could give out at any second, but I didn't stop. Branches tore at my arms and face, and I stumbled over roots, barely managing to keep myself upright. The sound of my own ragged breathing drowned out everything else. I didn't even know where I was anymore. There was no trail, no sign of anything familiar. All I knew was that I needed to keep moving, to put as much distance as I could between me and that light, that figure. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it was over. I burst out of the woods and onto the edge of the parking lot where my car was the only one left. The transition from the oppressive darkness to the open space was so jarring that I stopped in my tracks, gasping for air. The lot was completely empty, silent except for the faint hum of the nearby road. For a moment, I just stood there, staring back into the tree line, half expecting to see the glow of that phone screen or the figure stepping out into the open. But there was nothing, just darkness. My phone was still in my hand, the screen dim now. When I unlocked it, there were no messages, no notes, and the gallery was empty. The photos and videos were gone, like they'd never been there. I didn't wait around to question it. I jumped into my car, locking the doors the second I was inside. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. When the engine finally roared to life, I backed out of the lot so fast my tires squealed, leaving the trailhead and its suffocating darkness behind me. It wasn't until I was on the main road, surrounded by streetlights and the occasional passing car, that I started to feel like I could breathe again. But the uneasy feeling in my chest didn't go away. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following me or worse, someone in the back seat. When I got home, I locked every door and window and left every light on. I spent hours scrolling through my phone, trying to find the photos, the messages, anything, but there was nothing. It was like the whole thing had been wiped clean. Even the flashlight app didn't show up in my history. I've gone back and forth 100 times, trying to figure out if I imagined it, if it was some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But I can't explain the scratches on my arms and face, or why I haven't been able to sleep through the night since. And the worst part? Every now and then, When my phone buzzes with a random notification, my stomach twists. I'm terrified that one day, it'll be another note. Shadow on the trail. I've always loved hiking alone. There's something about the quiet, the fresh air, and the feeling of being completely disconnected that makes me feel alive. A few weeks ago, I went to a trail I hadn't visited in a while. Bear Ridge, if you know it. It's not super popular, but it's got some of the best views in the area. I parked at a small lot near the trailhead and noticed an old, beat-up blue truck parked a few spaces down. Didn't think much of it at the time, even though I didn't see anyone around. I strapped on my pack, checked my map, and started the hike. About 2 miles in, I stopped for water and noticed a guy up ahead on the trail. He was just standing there, kind of looking around. It caught me off guard because I hadn't passed anyone, and the parking lot was almost empty. I thought maybe he came from one of the side trails, so I waved and kept going. The weird thing is, a little while later, I saw him again. Same guy, same dark jacket and baseball cap, leaning against a tree like he'd been waiting. I remember feeling my stomach tighten a bit, but I told myself I was just overthinking it. Maybe he was hiking too and had taken a shortcut. Still, something felt off. He didn't wave back when I passed him this time, just sort of stared. I tried to shake it off and kept moving, but the rest of the hike felt different. Every noise made me jump, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. I didn't see him again that day, but the thought of him stuck with me. The next weekend, I decided to go to a completely different trail about an hour away, Crystal Lake Loop. It's one of my favorites because it's scenic but not crowded. I got there early, hoping to beat any weekend hikers. As I was unloading my gear, I noticed another car pulling in a few spots away. A blue truck. My heart dropped. At first, I told myself it was just a coincidence. There are probably hundreds of old blue trucks around. But then I saw him. Same dark jacket, same baseball cap, stepping out and adjusting his pack like he'd been there for hours and was just waiting. I tried to act casual, but my hands were shaking as I locked my car and headed straight for the trail. I made it about halfway around the loop before I spotted him again. He was on the other side of the lake, standing near the edge of the water, completely still, just watching. It was too far to make out his expression, but it didn't matter. I knew it was him. The realization hit me hard. He had followed me here. My mind raced. Did he somehow know I'd be here? Was he just going to stand there, or was this going somewhere worse? I didn't stick around to find out. I turned around and started walking fast, maybe too fast, back toward the parking lot, heart pounding with every step. When I got back to the parking lot, his truck was still there, but he wasn't. I didn't even want to stick around long enough to figure out where he might have gone. I threw my stuff in the car and drove off, trying to convince myself it wasn't as bad as it seemed. Maybe he wasn't actually following me. Maybe it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew better. The image of him standing by that lake wouldn't leave my mind. I decided I'd take a break from hiking for a while, at least until I felt less rattled. A couple of weeks passed, and I started to think maybe I'd overreacted. That's when I made my next mistake. A friend invited me to join her for a camping trip. Nothing major, just an overnight stay at a well-known spot a couple of hours away. She'd never been camping before and wanted someone with experience to tag along. I figured a group setting would feel safer, so I said yes. The first night went fine. We had a fire going, roasted marshmallows, and I even managed to relax. But just as we were getting ready to turn in, I thought I saw something, or someone, at the edge of the campsite, just beyond the firelight. A figure standing in the dark. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The firelight was flickering, and shadows were everywhere, but the longer I stared, the more certain I became. Someone was there, standing completely still, just watching us. I whispered to my friend, trying not to alarm her, but she laughed it off, saying it was probably an animal or my imagination. I didn't want to freak her out, so I pretended to agree, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept glancing toward the trees as we got into our tents, every little sound making my skin crawl. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Not the casual crunch of someone walking by, but slow, deliberate steps circling the campsite. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would wake my friend. I lay there, frozen, barely breathing, trying to convince myself it was a deer or maybe another camper wandering nearby. But then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone dragging something across the ground. It stopped right outside my tent. I could see the faint outline of feet through the fabric, and I swear, whoever it was just stood there, unmoving, for what felt like an eternity. I didn't dare move. My mind was racing, trying to think of what to do if he unzipped the tent or tried to come inside. I felt completely trapped, like a deer in headlights. Then, just as suddenly as the sound had started, it stopped. No footsteps, no dragging noise, just silence. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching my flashlight, flinching at every tiny rustle outside. By morning, I was exhausted but relieved to see the sunlight creeping through the tent. When I finally worked up the courage to step outside, I froze. The fire pit we'd put out the night before had been relit. Ashes were still smoldering, and a strange charred object, what looked like a bundle of sticks tied with twine, was sitting in the center. My friend came out of her tent, yawning, and when I pointed it out, she shrugged it off as a prank by other campers. But there were no other campers around. The nearest site was a good mile away. I didn't want to scare her, but I knew we weren't alone out there. Someone had been watching us, and now they wanted us to know. I convinced my friend to pack up early, pretending I just wasn't feeling well. She didn't argue, probably sensing my unease. As we were breaking down camp, I kept scanning the tree line, expecting to see him step out at any moment. But there was nothing, just the sound of the wind and the occasional bird. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. By the time we made it back to the car, I was so on edge I couldn't get the doors locked fast enough. We drove off, but that creeping feeling of being watched didn't leave me. About 15 minutes into the drive, we came to a bend in the road, and that's when I saw it, the blue truck. It was parked on the shoulder, half hidden by bushes. As we passed, I couldn't help but look, and there he was, sitting behind the wheel, staring straight ahead like he'd been waiting. I didn't tell my friend. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding insane. I just gripped the steering wheel tighter and kept driving, my heart racing the whole way home. After I dropped my friend off, I drove straight home, locked all my doors, and spent the rest of the day trying to shake off the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere. I kept replaying everything in my head, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was all just some bizarre coincidence. Maybe I was overreacting. But then I remembered how deliberate his movements had been. The way he just stood there, the fire pit, the truck. It didn't feel random. It felt calculated. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside made me jump, and I kept checking the window, half expecting to see his truck parked outside my house. Thankfully, it never came to that, but something in me had shifted. I haven't been back to the woods since, and I don't think I ever will. Hiking used to be my escape, my sanctuary, but now all I can think about is that feeling of being followed, that quiet, unshakable fear. Whoever he was, he's out there somewhere, and I'll never forget the way his shadow lingered in the dark, watching.